Today, our mini-series takes us to Hawaii, where we examine the 3 known serial killers from that state. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. Eugene Walter Barrett was the first confirmed and known serial killer in Hawaii. And by the end of this story, you're probably going to want to pull your hair out. Eugene Walter Barrett was born on June 30th, 1931 in Oakland, California. He was the older of 2 sons, born to Howard and Emily Barrett. Not much is known about his childhood other than he dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He would join the Army and fight in the Korean War, but was dishonorably discharged in 1955 due to his excessive drinking. After his discharge from the Army, he permanently moved to Honolulu, Hawaii. There, he began a relationship with a woman named Annie E. Phillips, and she was a divorced mother of 5 children. At this point, Eugene Barrett was a house painter, but he was mostly unemployed and drank excessively. This would eventually lead to Annie Phillips leaving him for good in 1959. But little did she know, Eugene couldn't handle rejection. This is when Eugene formed a plan. He was going to murder his ex-girlfriend. He armed himself with a gun, got on a bus, went to her apartment complex, and forced his way inside her home. In the living room, 2 of her children were watching TV, and he just walked right past them, went to her bedroom, where she was taking care of her youngest child. Before she even had time to react to what was happening, Eugene Barrett would pull out his gun and shoot her multiple times. The neighbors would hear this and rush to her apartment complex where they found Eugene with the gun. They would hold him down and wait for police to arrive. At his trial, Eugene Barrett would say that he doesn't remember shooting Annie, that he was too drunk to recall. But at the scene, witnesses would claim that he said, quote, "She deserved it." Eugene would be found guilty, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The thing is, that was later reduced to 15 to 50 years. And in 1967, he was paroled. The strange thing is, he was paroled by the then governor, and nobody seems to know why. Eugene Barrett would return to Honolulu, where he married another woman, and her name was Roberta Averio, and that was in February of 1971. Unfortunately, their marriage was short-lived, much like his relationship with Annie, and she would file for divorce in November of 1972. Her reason for the divorce was her husband's excessive drinking. Unfortunately, a month later, he went to her hotel and began to stab her multiple times with a kitchen knife. And again, he was arrested. He waived his right to a trial and would plead guilty. The thing is, he pled guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter. He was sentenced to only 10 years in prison. And once again, he was paroled in 1976. But his parole requirements were dismissed in 1982. During the 80s, he would reside in an apartment complex and continue his excessive drinking, and it would seem that he became more emotionally unstable as time went on. Across from his apartment lived his neighbor, 41-year-old Denisha Kastner. It would turn out his neighbor had a history of both substance abuse and sexual abuse, and although she had, quote, a history of sexual abuse, I'm not sure what that means, she was allowed to take care of her 7-year-old son, Ethan. Eugene Barrett would accuse her of mocking him by dating other men, and he would say that she indecently exposed herself in front of him. Yet there is no confirmation that they had an intimate relationship. Friends and acquaintances of Eugene would claim that he would sometimes call them on the phone, and he would be hysterical, and he said that he was afraid that his neighbor was going to harm him. He would voluntarily ask to be admitted for psychiatric treatment, and he would remain there until August of 1995. When he was released, that neighbor that apparently deeply upset him had moved across the street, and this set Eugene Barrett into a rage. He believed that she would have moved away from the neighborhood altogether. In August of 1995, only a few days after his release, he would go on a drinking binge. He would head to the local store to get more alcohol, and that's when he saw his neighbor entering her apartment. So he would go back to his apartment, get a gun, walk across the street, right past her son, Ethan, who was playing in the front yard. He would go inside her home, into her bedroom, and when she turned to face him, he shot her twice in the head and left the room. Of course, witnesses saw him leaving the apartment complex, including her son, Ethan, and Ethan would immediately call his father, and his father would call the authorities. Unfortunately, she was taken to the hospital and died of her injuries. The following day, Eugene Barrett would enter an inn and he'd tell the manager to call the police so he could surrender peacefully. As we all know, he has been released twice after murdering 2 of the women in his life. So his third murder charge sparked lots of controversy. During the hearings, Ethan was called to testify against Eugene, and this made him one of the youngest witnesses to take the stand in the state's history. And Ethan would go on to tell the story of what happened that day, which was also backed up by many of his mother's neighbors. Eugene would tell his attorney that he wished to remain incarcerated until he could deal with, quote, his problem. So the judge would revoke his bail, which meant he was going to be imprisoned until his trial would take place. Of course, Eugene's attorney would say that his client's actions were a result of obviously his neighbor's mistreatment of him, and that basically he snapped and would kill her in a fit of rage. Eugene Barrett would even say that he, quote, wanted to kill the bitch for constantly, quote, choosing all the other guys over him. He was found guilty on all accounts and received an automatic life sentence. After his sentencing, he was transferred to an out-of-state facility in Oklahoma, where he spent the majority of his prison sentence. Every now and then, his son's wife would send him photos of his grandsons, but his son hated him, and he would not reach out to his father. In 2003, Eugene Barrett was returned to a Hawaii prison, but he would fall ill and die from an undisclosed illness in November. While researching this case, I was just completely shocked that this man kept getting out of prison. I can't believe that a governor would waive his prison sentence. I don't understand why or how that happened or what was the reasoning, and it seems that nobody knows. But he murdered a woman he was involved with, went to jail, got out, murdered another woman, and he was still released from prison. I just can't wrap my head around it. And then he would murder again, and then he got a life sentence? That just seems completely wrong. It does seem that Eugene Barrett thought women owed him their time, love, and affection, and he took rejection obviously incredibly hard. I would be curious to see what type of treatment he received in those facilities, the mental health hospital, if he was diagnosed with, depression or bipolar or something. But I think we can all agree that he should have never been let out of prison the first time. The Honolulu Strangler is an unidentified serial killer that killed 5 women in Hawaii from 1985 to 1986. He's the second known serial killer active in the state. The FBI would go on to say that the Honolulu Strangler is not a stalker, but more so an opportunistic and organized killer who abducts women in vulnerable locations like bus stops and parking lots. They would say that he's most likely a white male between 30 and 40, drives a cargo van, and has no criminal record, and they absolutely believed that he would kill again. The Honolulu Strangler's first victim was a woman known as Vicky Purdy. Vicky was only 25, but she was described as a feisty woman who could hold her own. Vicky had always dreamed of living in Hawaii, but when she got there, she did struggle to kind of adjust to the laid-back lifestyle. But she would become more settled when she started working at a video store. In May of 1984, after a night out with friends, Vicky was reported missing. She was last seen at midnight by a taxi driver who dropped her off at her car. Her husband would say that Vicky had planned to be home around 9 p.m. that night, and when he went looking for her, he found her car parked in the same place she left it. He would say that there was a new dent in her car, but there was no sign of Vicky anywhere. The Honolulu Police Department received a phone call later reporting a body by Kauai Lagoon. Unfortunately, they found the body of Vicky Purdy. She had been wearing the same clothes that she had disappeared in, and they said that her injuries were consistent with a homicide. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she had been strangled. The case would go cold for months with no leads, and then a second victim would be found in January of 1986. In January of 1986, a 17-year-old high school student known as Regina Sakamoto went missing after calling her boyfriend to let him know that she would be late to school that day. She had missed the school bus, so she had to take the local bus, and she was last seen waiting at the bus stop. When she didn't return home from school that night, her family immediately called the police and reported her missing, and her body was found in the Kauai Lagoon, less than 1 mile from the location of Vicky Purdy's body. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she had been strangled. Because the 2 murders were so similar, the police began to believe they had a serial killer on their hands. And soon the killer would strike again, this time only 2 weeks later. On January 30th, 1986, 3 men found the body of a 21-year-old woman woman known as Denise Hughes, and she was found in a drainage canal. And much like the other victims, Denise was last seen at a bus stop. She was found strangled with her hands tied behind her back. Denise took the bus every single day to and from work. It appears that on the day she went missing, she had been at the bus stop earlier than her usual time. Several weeks later, the body of Louise Meteroyes would be found. The 24-year-old's body was found under a freeway pass. Unfortunately, she had the same injuries as the other woman, but she was 3 months pregnant. She had returned to the island to visit her family. Much like the other victim, she was last seen at a bus stop, but this time the bus stop was at the Honolulu airport. 36-year-old Linda Pesce was known to be streetwise and tough. When she moved to Hawaii, she was married and had a daughter, but her and her husband would separate and she would move in with one of her friends. In April of 1986, she was reported missing by her roommate. Police would find her car on the side of a highway, and they theorized that she had car trouble and left on foot to the bus stop. Witnesses would report seeing a light-colored van nearby and possibly a Caucasian man near her car. And then strangely enough, 4 days after her disappearance, a man matching the witnesses' descriptions would walk into the Honolulu Police Department and claim a psychic told him where they could find Linda's body. So of course, when this man comes into the police station and he says, "Hey, a psychic told me where you can find Linda's body," the police are looking at him funny. But they decide to kind of go along with it and see if this man can lead them to her body. So they were like, "Okay, where did the psychic say that, Linda was, and can you take us to her?" And this man would take them to Linda's body. 43-year-old Howard Andrew Gay took police to Sand Island, but as they're walking around searching for this body, they're kind of watching this man, and they notice he's avoiding one particular area. So police go over and they're checking this area, and they come across Linda's body. They would say that her injuries were similar to the other victims. She had been strangled, and her hands were tied behind her back. Police would say that the victims were bound with strapping tape or zip ties. They would say this man, Howard Gay, worked at an air cargo operation where he had access to those materials on a daily basis. And so they arrested him for murder in May of 1986. He was questioned for several hours, and he really just put his head down and said he didn't do it. They would also bring in his girlfriend, and she told investigators that some nights when they fought, he would leave the house, and on those nights were the same nights that the murders occurred. A witness would come forward and say that she saw Linda with a man on the night that she went missing, and she picked Howard Gay out of a lineup. But she didn't want to testify at court because she was scared for her safety. But at this point, police are absolutely convinced that they found the Honolulu Strangler, but they didn't have sufficient evidence to convict him. They would monitor this man for years to come, but they could never directly link him to the murders. And he would die in 2003 at the age of 60 in California, and he was never charged with those murders. Our final killer is the Kauai Serial Killer. In April of 2000, the body of Lisa Bissell, who was a 38-year-old woman, was found in a ditch close to a state park. She had been raped, beaten, and later stabbed to death. It also appeared that her throat was slashed. Some of her belongings were found off of a road, so it was believed that she was abducted from that road. In May of 2000, a 52-year-old woman known as Nancy Jones was severely wounded when a perpetrator approached her in the yard that she was working in. And he would say to her, "My name is John and I'm homeless." So the victim would recommend that he visit her neighbor's home where the owner frequently let homeless people camp on their property. When she turned around to continue working because she thought the conversation was over, the man forcibly took her behind the house, beat her, broke one of her arms, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her in the chest with a knife. Luckily, the knife would bend after it hit the victim's breastbone, so he threw it in a bush and ran away. The victim would crawl as she's in this incredible amount of pain until she reached a telephone to call for help, and she did survive. In August of 2000, the decomposing body of Darren R. Singer, who was a 43-year-old woman from Maui, was found at a remote campsite near a beach. She had been raped, stabbed in the throat, and beaten to death. The perpetrator had beat her so badly that her face was beyond the point of recognition. Investigators did determine that she was murdered at least 12 hours prior to the discovery of her body. Although the surviving victim did describe her attacker and a composition sketch of the perpetrator was created, a few months after the attack, she was flown to Honolulu and shown a police lineup. But the victim was only able to eliminate 2 men from the lineup, and she wasn't able to narrow it down any further. police would believe that they had a serial killer on their hands. All the victims were middle-aged white women with similar heights and weights. They were sexually assaulted, they were alone when they were attacked, and a knife was used in every single attack. They also said that all of the attacks happened on the west coast of Kauai. At this time, of course, they went and questioned every sex offender on the island. And their prime suspect became Waldorf Roy Wilson. This man had been convicted of rape and kidnapping, but he was paroled in 1999 and moved to Kauai. In September of 2000, he was arrested again for violating his parole. Eventually, they would test his DNA against that of the perpetrator, but the results seemed to be inconclusive, so he was never charged with the murders. It turns out that police do have a prime suspect, and they say that they're watching him closely, but that's the only information that they would give. Although it's 23 years later, it appears that nobody has been arrested yet. So there you have it, the 3 known serial killers that operated in Hawaii. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video and want to support the channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.